Take a deep breath and let the world of today gently slip away. As you settle in, nestled in the quiet comfort of your space, imagine yourself drifting back through Timano to the bustling grandeur of imperial cities, nor to the refined salons of aristocrats, but instead to the rough-hewn edge of the known world, a place of dust and wind, of crackling campfires, and endless silence under starlit skies. This is the American frontier. The word frontier stirs images of courage and expansion, but tonight we explore not the glory or the myths, but the realities, the humdrum, the uncomfortable, the quietly astonishing facts that made up daily existence for those who carved a life out of the vast, untamed land stretching across the western territories of 18th and 19th century America. Together, we'll walk slowly through the unvarnished details of frontier life, its smells, its inconveniences, its peculiar customs, and the many adaptations that allowed settlers to survive, and sometimes even thrive, on land that neither welcomed nor accommodated them. Let the rhythm of history settle over you. Let the quiet grit of a bygone world lull you gently towards sleep. And so, we begin with the first of our many dusty footsteps by stepping into a frontier cabin, just as the sun begins to set. Picture yourself standing before a crude log cabin. It leans slightly to one side, the timbers stacked with uneven skill, chinked with mud and straw that crackles in the wind. The door creaks open on leather hinges. There is no metal to spare, and inside, a room no larger than a modest shed. The air is thick with the scent of old wood smoke, dried herbs, and the faint musk of unwashed wool. Everything inside serves a purpose. Against the wall, a bed stuffed with straw sags low, covered in a patchwork quilt faded by years of use. In one corner, a cast-iron kettle sits over a hearth that flickers with the last of the evening's firewood. The walls are bare, save for a single shelf holding a tin cup, a pewter plate, and a copy of the Bible, often the only book that made the journey west. Living on the frontier meant simplicity, but not by choice. Most families brought with them only what they could carry in a wagon. Furniture was crafted by hand, tools were prized beyond measure, and food was whatever could be hunted, grown, or bartered. Days began before the sun, and ended long after its fading, driven not by convenience, but by necessity. There was no plumbing here. If you needed water, you fetched it from a stream. If you were lucky, from a shallow well, if you had the time and resources to dig one. Bathing was a rare event, performed in a tin basin with water heated over fire. In the bitter winters, it was often forgone entirely. Hair grew long, clothes grew stiff, and the scent of sweat became part of daily life. To relieve oneself, one would step out perhaps 50 paces away, depending on the terrain, to a small, drafty outhouse. Its wooden seat was often shared by spiders, sometimes snakes, and always the chill of whatever season prevailed. In winter, it was avoided if possible. Chamber pots, small and discreet, were used inside, their contents discarded discreetly at dawn. Meals were rudimentary. Cornbread, salt pork, beans, and whatever vegetables survived the growing season formed the bulk of the diet. Coffee, if available, was often reused grounds boiled again and again until the bitter strength became little more than coloured water. Spices were rare, and salt was treasured like gold. Leftovers were rare not because food kept well, but because nothing was wasted. A hardened crust of bread could be soaked in milk. Bones became broth. Fat was rendered for candles, soap, or cooking. And then there was the ever-present dirt. Dust blew in through cracks in the walls. It settled on every surface. It clung to skin, to fabric, to lungs. Children played in it. Animals tracked it indoors, and adults fought it daily with straw brooms and wet rags. Mud in the spring, dry powder in summer, icy clumps in winter dirt was a constant companion. Shoes, when worn, were coated in it. Clothes were rarely washed, and when they were, it was by hand, in cold water, with lye soap that burned the skin and left hands raw. Illness was frequent, and there was little to treat it. A cough could linger for months. A fever might pass or it might not. There were home remedies involving roots, alcohol, and prayer. Doctors were distant, often untrained, and certainly expensive. Most people simply waited to get better, or they didn't. Children learned early that life was labor. They fetched water, fed animals, gathered firewood, and hoed rows of crops. Schooling, if it existed, was seasonal, informal, and secondary to survival. Yet they knew the sky, the soil, and the signs of weather far better than most would today. Clothing was mended again and again. A single dress might last a girl years. Trousers were patched until patches covered more than cloth. Shoes were handed down, resoled, or made anew from tanned hides. Every item was valued. A broken needle was a crisis. A torn boot could mean frostbite. There were no stores down the road, only what you could craft or trade. Yet in the quiet evenings, when chores were finished and bellies were modestly full, families would sit around the fire. Perhaps a fiddle would be played, perhaps a story told. Perhaps, in the rarest moments of calm, there would be silence, just the gentle creaking of wood, the murmur of wind through the cracks, and the shared warmth of survival. Life on the American frontier was not clean, nor was it comfortable, but it was deeply real each moment, shaped by necessity, each breath filled with the scent of effort, of endurance, and of the untamed land that both resisted and embraced its settlers. And now, as you take in this quiet world of survival and simplicity, let your mind gently prepare for the next chapter of our journey. Now imagine yourself shifting your gaze slightly, settling into the daily rhythm, not of a place, but of a person. Picture a woman, perhaps in her early 30s, though the harshness of her years may make her appear older. Her name might have been Martha, or Eliza, or perhaps Abigail, common names that drifted westward from colonial roots. She stands outside her cabin at dawn, a thin shawl wrapped around her shoulders, watching the horizon for signs of weather or trouble. Her face is sun-leathered and taut, her hands thick with calluses, her movements efficient and unadorned. Her hair is pinned up tightly, always out of the way, and her dress, long and practical, is layered against the bite of morning air. She carries a pail in each hand, heading to the well before breakfast begins. The children still sleep, the livestock stir softly, and already her day has begun. A frontier woman's life was not so much divided by tasks as it was ruled by theme and long, uninterrupted chain of labor from sunrise to dusk. Meals did not prepare themselves, nor did fuel for the hearth gather itself. From grinding cornmeal with stone mortars to stretching dough over a cast-iron pan, cooking was an act of endurance. The stove, if she had one, consumed wood as voraciously as it gave heat. If not, then the hearth served every purpose: boiling, roasting, drying, warming. Washing clothes was a weekly ordeal that involved drawing gallons of water, heating it over fire, and scrubbing linens with caustic soap made from lye and animal fat. In the absence of washing boards, rocks and knotted sticks did the job. The process took hours. The results were never truly clean. On windy days, the clothes froze stiff on the line. On calm ones, they took on the dust that settled invisibly from the ever-blowing earth. Children were everywhere, and nowhere could they be ignored. The average frontier woman might bear 7 to 10 children in her lifetime, though many would not survive infancy. Childbirth happened at home, often alone, or with the help of another settler woman. There were no antiseptics, no trained midwives, just boiled water, clean cloths, and the kind of grit that defied polite description. Women delivered babies squatting by beds, leaning against walls, or kneeling in straw. And when the birth was done, work resumed. There was no maternity leave on the frontier. Beyond the hearth, the frontier woman also took up arms when needed. While her husband hunted or travelled, she stood guard, rifle in hand, against wolves, coyotes, and sometimes people. She helped butcher animals, cured hides, stitched moccasins, and drove away predators from her garden. She made candles from tallow, soap from ash and grease, and remedies from wild herbs ground in wooden bowls. Her world was small in geography but immense in responsibility. She knew how to trap, to smoke meat, to prepare poultices for burns, and how to fashion toys from rags and corn husks for her children. She made ink from walnut husks, used feathers as pens, and taught her children letters on slate boards smoothed by years of use. If there was a Bible, she read it by the flicker of a grease lamp. If not, she repeated the verses by memory, passed down like heirlooms. Social life for a woman on the frontier was rare and precious. A visit from a neighbor might require hours of walking, or a full day by wagon. But when it came, it was a balm. Women shared news, traded supplies, and offered companionship that transcended hardship. In these small gatherings, they swapped seeds, stories, and advice on how to survive the unending, uneven demands of the land. There was little room for fragility, and even less for complaint. To endure was to succeed. To persist was the quiet triumph. A broken ankle might be splintered with carved sticks. A fever might be sweat out beneath blankets soaked in vinegar. Life expectancy was short, but the will to live, particularly among frontier women, was longer than any trail they walked. Some women wrote journals. A few of these survived. Their entries are spare, factual, quietly poetic. They mention births and burials in the same breath. They describe storms that tore through homes, fires that consumed months of labor, and blizzards that took the lives of livestock huddled just beyond the cabin wall. Yet the tone is never theatrical. It is measured, and always forward-looking. In one such account, a woman writes that after burying her infant beside the cabin, she returned inside and boiled beans for supper. There is no elaboration, just the continuation of life, the unflinching march of need over grief. And still, amid all this, there were moments of softness, a flower pressed in a book, a string of beads carved from bone, a cherished letter from a sibling back east, a shawl from mother's hands, the way she braided her daughter's hair on Sunday morning, even if the nearest church was 100 miles away. These were the small luxuries, the human echoes that endured. So tonight, as you breathe gently and imagine this woman's life, her quiet strength, her resilience etched not in headlines but in footsteps and firewood, know that the frontier was not built by men alone. It was held together, thread by careful thread, by hands like hers, Ruth, skilled and unshakably steady. Let her presence linger gently in your mind as we prepare to shift our gaze toward another layer of frontier, lifeless, visible, but no less fascinating. As the flickering light of the cabin fades behind you, let your thoughts wander now not toward the sweeping vistas or the harsh winters of the American frontier, but toward something more intimate, something almost invisible, yet utterly inescapable, the matter of cleanliness. To live on the frontier was to live in a world without indoor plumbing, without modern soap, and without the daily rituals of hygiene we take for granted. Yet people endured, adapted, and fashioned their own relationship with the ideas of cleanliness and bodily care. Tonight, we peer into that quiet, often overlooked world not to judge, but to understand. The first thing to consider is water. Clean running water was a luxury few pioneers possessed. Streams, springs, and hand-dug wells provided the bulk of water for drinking, cooking, washing, and livestock. Every drop had to be hauled by hand, in buckets, sometimes across long distances. Heating it required firewood and time. The result was a deeply conservative approach to water use, especially for tasks not seen as immediately essential. Bathing, for example, was infrequent, not absent, but infrequent, reserved for special occasions or times of visible need. A full-body wash might take place once a week during warmer seasons, perhaps less often in winter. A metal basin would be filled with heated water and placed near the hearth or outside in the sun. Family members would take turns, youngest to oldest, often using the same water. Modesty and practicality entwined themselves tightly. Soap was homemade, crafted from rendered animal fat and lye, itself created by pouring water through wood ashes. The result was a pungent, caustic substance that cleaned but also stripped the skin raw. It was used sparingly, more often for clothing and dishes than for delicate skin. For personal washing, people might rely on plain water, rough cloths, or sometimes herbal infusions, mint, lavender, or yarrow when available. Hair care was equally practical. Men often kept their hair short, not for style but for ease. Women braided or pinned theirs up, washing it only occasionally with water and whatever mild solution could be fashioned. Lye soap could damage the scalp, so alternatives were sought. Rainwater, sometimes mixed with a bit of baking soda, if such a commodity could be spared. Combs were prized possessions, often carved from bone or wood, used to remove dust, lice or tangles. And lice, yes, they were common. Fleas, too. With livestock close at hand, limited laundering, and warm sleeping arrangements, infestations were a reality of life. Many households would hang bedding outside in sunlight, hoping the heat might drive pests away. Smoke was another deterrent. Beds, mattresses, and garments might be smoked over a low fire to kill insects. Camphor, pine needles, and strong herbs were tucked into linens as a fragrant shield, though success varied. Toileting, as we touched on earlier, was rudimentary. Outhouses were common but not universal. In some cases, especially in isolated or transient settlements, people used simple dug pits or the woods. Chamber pots were a convenience at night, emptied discreetly in the morning. In winter, snow served more than one purpose. Leaves, corn cobs, or scraps of cloth often stood in for toilet paper. It was a system built on resourcefulness, not comfort. Body odor was simply part of life. Not offensive, merely expected. Everyone shared in the same limitations. Fragrance, when used, came from natural saucer sachets of dried herbs, scented handkerchiefs, or smoke from a favored wood. The scent of the frontier was a blend of wood smoke, sweat, leather, and earth. Not unpleasant, but undeniably human. Clothing care followed the same philosophy. Most garments were made from wool, linen, or coarse cotton. Washing involved long hours of soaking, scrubbing, and boiling. Colors faded quickly, fabric weakened over time, and garments were worn far past the point of what today would be considered clean. Yet care was taken. Aprons protected dresses. Outer layers bore the brunt of labor. Stains were treated not to beautify, but to preserve. In terms of oral hygiene, few possessed toothbrushes in the modern sense. A twig, frayed at the end, served as a brushing tool. Some chewed fresh leaves or rinsed with salt water. Tooth powders made from charcoal, chalk, or crushed herbs were sometimes used, though rarely in a daily routine. Dental pain was treated with clove oil, whiskey, or simply endured. Illnesses related to poor hygiene did exist. Infections, fevers, and skin conditions took hold easily, especially in crowded or unsanitary conditions. Yet people developed resilience. Cuts were cleaned with alcohol if available, or packed with herbs. Boils were lanced carefully. People learned, by necessity, how to recognize the early signs of trouble, and how to intervene with what little they had. Children, often barefoot, developed thick calluses. Their faces were smudged with dirt more often than not, and their hands bore the grime of outdoor play and labor. But this too was considered normal. What we might now call filthy was, in frontier terms, simply life. A child scrubbed clean for Sunday service might be back to their dusty state by mid-afternoon. And yet, despite all these limitations, there remained a kind of order. Clothing might be mended dozens of times, but always with care. Hair might be rarely washed, but it was brushed and arranged. Homes, however humble, were swept daily. Beds were made. Water, though precious, was stored with intention. Cleanliness, then, was not about sterility. It was about dignity within the means available. As you drift through these quiet reflections, consider how radically different their world of hygiene was from your sand, how those subtle discomforts shaped daily thought, energy, and patience. In a land where the sky was vast and the land unforgiving, small rituals of cleanliness were acts of resistance, of control, of holding back the chaos of wilderness with a bar of lye soap and a bucket of warm water. So rest now, soothed by the humble rhythm of a world that carried on it in polished perfection, but in practical persistence. And next, we'll turn our thoughts to the grand contrast, to the lives of the rare wealthy, educated, or powerful, who moved westward with different tools, different comforts, and different expectations. As your thoughts continue to drift across the dusty plains and rugged hills of the American frontier, allow yourself now to imagine a different scene, one that doesn't begin with rough hands drawing water or children chasing pigs across muddy yards, but rather a scene of subtle privilege, set against the very same backdrop. For though the frontier was largely shaped by toil, there were those who arrived with wealth, education, or political power, individuals and families who brought with them a touch of refinement, a lingering scent of civilization that clung to their presence, even as the wind tried to strip it away. These were the frontier elite, not many in number, but striking in contrast. You might picture a larger home, not quite a mansion, but grand in comparison to the one-room cabins surrounding it. 2 stories, perhaps, made from hand-cut timber, with a stone hearth and glass windows imported from the east at great cost. There might be a porch with a wooden rocking chair, its seat worn smooth, not from factory precision, but from patient, daily use. A front parlour, with wallpaper peeling slightly in the humidity, yet still elegant in its design. Perhaps even a piano, slightly out of tune, brought westward in a wagon, and played gently by candlelight. These individuals were often merchants, government officials, or landowners who had the means to acquire property during expansion, and the foresighter lucto claim land near developing towns. Their homes were filled with things most frontier families never saw: real books, silverware, imported fabrics, oil lamps, and clocks that ticked reliably through the long, quiet hours. Women in these households wore dresses made from finer cloth muslin, wool serge, or silk if they could manage it. They wrote letters in neat script, sealed with wax, and sent east with postal riders who braved difficult terrain. Some hosted teas or modest social gatherings, during which the latest periodicals from Boston or New York might be read aloud and discussed. And yet, they were still frontier dwellers. Their lives, too, were shaped by distance, by scarcity, and by the constant push of nature against comfort. A woman who had once employed a maid in Philadelphia now tended her own garden. A gentleman who had studied law by gaslight now patched roofs or dug wells when hired help was unavailable. Refined tools rusted just the same. Silk faded in the same sun. Education was more accessible in these households. Children were taught arithmetic, reading and writing by parents or hired tutors. If a town was nearby, they might attend a schoolhouse. If not, they studied by lantern light, their lessons broken by chores and the demands of land. Books were shared among families, read aloud after supper, and sometimes copied by hand to preserve them. A knowledge of poetry, history, and foreign language marked these households as cultured islands in a sea of survival. But even wealth could not insulate fully from the realities of the frontier. Illness did not discriminate. Isolation pressed on the minds of all. Though their cabins were larger, they still creaked in the wind. Though their boots were finer, they still sank into the same mud. And while they might serve tea in porcelain cups, they brewed it with water drawn from the same well. Some of these elite became pillars of their communities, founding schools, libraries, or local governments. Their wealth allowed them to purchase land, but also to shape towns. They donated to churches, imported supplies, and lobbied for railroads. Many became newspaper editors, town mayors, or judges. Their influence stitched civilization slowly into the fabric of the frontier. Others, however, were less charitable land speculators who raised prices, traders who set unfair terms, or absentee owners who extracted resources and left. Privilege was a double-edged tool. It could build bridges or create divisions. In settlements where survival depended on trust and cooperation, arrogance was quickly remembered. Yet even among the elite, there were limits. A heavy snowfall could trap a well-stocked family just as easily as a poor one. A prairie fire showed no preference in whose home it consumed. Drought, crop failure, banditry, these reminders arrived without invitation. And when they did, the veneer of refinement could fall away quickly, revealing that all who settled the frontier, regardless of means, were still at the mercy of the land. Still, there were moments of grace. A formal dinner served in a log home, the table set with mismatched silver and candle stubs. A handwritten poem, read aloud to visitors during a long winter night. A Sunday afternoon picnic, complete with linen napkins and a violin played under the shade of a cottonwood tree. These moments, quiet, deliberate, and beautifully ordinary, were the lifeblood of elite households, grounding them amidst the harshness that surrounded them. As you rest, let yourself feel the stillness of one such evening. The fire is low, the dishes have been cleared, and the wind outside presses softly against the walls. A woman reads aloud from Emerson, her voice steady and slow. A child dozes in the corner, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote calls into the night. Privilege exists here, yes, but it is shaped by the same silence, the same stars, and the same fragile hope that ties all frontier lives together. Next, we'll leave these households and turn instead to the small settlements and communities that began to rise, haphazard and hopeful, in the spaces between wilderness and civilization. Let your thoughts wander now from the solitude of isolated cabins and the occasional luxuries of frontier elites to the fragile beginnings of community, the scattered footprints of humanity, gathering slowly into villages, towns, and something resembling society. On the American frontier, communities did not begin with grandeur. They often emerged as cluster-sluice associations of families, drawn together by proximity, shared hardship, and the essential need for support. Imagine a clearing at the edge of a forest, a crossroads beside a river, or a patch of prairie made habitable by the nearby presence of water and wood. These were the birthplaces of towns not on maps, not by decree, but by habit, necessity, and the invisible magnetism of people longing not to be alone. Early settlements might consist of just a few homesteads within sight of each other. Paths between them would be worn by foot, then wagon, eventually evolving into roads. A trading post might follow sometimes little more than a tent or wooden shack offering nails, flour, tobacco, and news from the wider world. If the settlement held, other structures followed. A blacksmith's forge, a small schoolhouse, a livery, and eventually a church. And with time, perhaps even a general store where molasses sat in wooden barrels and bolts of calico hung from dusty rafters. These towns did not grow evenly. Some withered after a season, others blossomed into regional hubs. Their fate often hinged on natural features, a navigable river, a reliable weller on the unpredictable decisions of railway planners or stagecoach routes. But wherever they formed, they became lifelines for those living beyond the perimeter. The people who settled them were rarely from the same background. Some were farmers seeking fertile land, others were freed slaves looking for a place to build new lives. Immigrants from Germany, Ireland, Sweden, and beyond added their customs, languages, and faiths. Though divisions existed over land, religion, or race-practical cooperation, often overruled difference. A neighbor was a neighbor, especially when storms tore roofs away or when a child fell ill in the night. Social life revolved around shared events. A barn raising was not only a construction project, but a festival. Neighbors came from miles away, tools in hand, ready to work together. Women cooked, children played, and men hammered beams into place, while stories were told and alliances were formed. These moments were not just about building structures, they were about binding people together. Church services were central to most communities, often held in the same space used for school during the week. These gatherings brought people in from the wide stretches of surrounding countryside. Whether Methodist, Baptist, Lutheran, or otherwise, faith provided structure, purpose, and a sense of shared identity. The sermons were long, the benches hard, but the ritual of coming together was cherished. Schools were humble, usually one-room structures with a single teacher responsible for students of all ages. Lessons were brief and practical reading, writing, arithmetic with slates, replacing paper and memorization taking the place of textbooks. Attendance was irregular, dictated by seasons, harvests, or storms. But in these classrooms, generations began their tentative steps toward literacy and knowledge. Entertainment was sparse, but deeply appreciated. A fiddle at a dance, a storytelling evening by firelight, a traveling showman or preacher, a potluck dinner. Life was quiet, but not entirely without joy. Holidays, when celebrated, were local affairs. Thanksgiving, Independence Day, or Harvest Festival each, marking a shared passage of time and labor. Mail, when it came, brought with it not just letters but connection. Newspapers arrived weeks late, but were read eagerly, even aloud. Recipes, remedies, poems, and editorials passed from hand to hand, binding remote households into a sense of national belonging. News of wars, of politics, of inventions and disasters these trickled into settlements like rain after drought. Markets and fairs were held when possible, often timed with seasonal changes. Here, produce and livestock were traded, and news exchanged. Young people met one another, courtships began, and marriages were arranged with quiet dignity. These public events were the heartbeat of community, pulsing slowly through the wilderness. And yet, even in these growing social webs, isolation never fully disappeared. Winter could sever towns from one another for months. Illness could isolate a household entirely. Loneliness was a constant thread, even for those surrounded by family and friends. Letters took weeks or months to reach loved ones. Supplies could vanish with a missed delivery or a broken wagon axle, and the knowledge that danger from weather, wild animals, or people could arrive without warning created a steady undercurrent of vigilance. Still, through persistence, these settlements endured. They became something more than survival posts. They became symbols of permanence in an impermanent land. Children born in these towns knew no other world. They learned to read from the same chalkboard their siblings had, to sing the same hymns, to speak in the same slow, considered drawl of those who measured their words carefully. In time, some of these settlements grew into cities. Most did not, but each, in its own way, offered a gentle defiance against the wilderness, a place where the human need for company, for recognition, and for ritual could take root. As you rest here, in the imagined quiet of a frontier town at night, the sky above it vast and indifferent, think of the flickering lamplight in the homes below, of conversations spoken in low tones, of bread cooling on wooden tables, and of the delicate, unseen threads connecting one household to another, making something that, for the first time in days of travel, began to feel like home. Next, we'll follow a more shadowed path into the lives of those who wandered the frontier without ties, the loners, drifters, and outcasts who lived between communities, often unseen. As you continue to drift gently through the quiet landscapes of frontier life, let your thoughts now follow the narrow paths that do not lead to settlements or well-tended farms. Instead, imagine the in-between spaces, the worn tracks through the prairie, the shaded hollows in the woods, the solitary shacks far from any trail. Here lived a different kind of frontier soul. Not the homesteader or the storekeeper, not the preacher or the town matron, but the wanderer, the drifter, the ones who moved through this land as shadows on its margins. The American frontier was as much a refuge as it was a promise. For some, it offered a chance to build. For others, it offered a chance to disappear. You might picture a man known only by his first name, or perhaps by a nickname, Dusty Joe, or Pegleg Sam. He arrives in town with a bedroll over his shoulder, a battered hat pulled low, and few words to share. He works for a day or two, splitting fence rails, driving cattle, fixing roofs, then moves on, vanishing down the trail without ceremony. No family waits for him, no letters are sent or received. His story is his own, and he shares it sparingly. Many of these wanderers had once lived more settled lives, soldiers discharged from forgotten battles, men broken by bad harvests, by debts, or by personal tragedy. Immigrants who lost their way, or who chose solitude over failure. A few were outlaws, it's true, though most simply preferred the silence of the road to the weight of expectations. To live as a drifter was not always to run from the law, but often to run from memory. They found shelter wherever it could be claimed, under rock overhangs, in abandoned buildings, or beneath crude lean-tos of sapling and hide. Food was hunted, fished, or bartered. Clothes were patched endlessly, often little more than layers of rough wool and canvas. Some carried books or journals. Others carried only tools, a knife, a pan, a flint. Among them were also women, far fewer in number and often more vulnerable. They were widows, runaways, or former servants who chose the wilderness over the confines of urban poverty or servitude. Some lived with small children, moving carefully from one camp to another, dependent on their wits and the occasional kindness of strangers. Society tended to view these figures with unease. Settlers might offer food, a night's lodging, or a job, but always with a wary eye. To be rootless was to be suspect. Rumours clung to such people like burrs to wool. Were they thieves, escaped criminals, carriers of disease? Yet in truth, most were simply tired, or wounded in ways not visible, seeking silence that could not be found in towns. Occasionally, a drifter would settle, drawn in by a kind family, a piece of land, or a quiet companionship. Some became valued helpers, living with a family for years, never quite one of them, but never truly apart either. Others faded deeper into the wilderness, building lives so solitary that even death might find them unaccompanied, their stories untold. There were outcasts, too, not merely wanderers, but those pushed from community by scandal, suspicion, or difference. A man accused rightly or wrongly of theft might be driven from a town and forced to find a life elsewhere. A woman who bore a child outside of marriage might retreat to a cabin at the edge of the woods, raising her child in obscurity. Others were simply different in ways the frontier did not understand or tolerate: those who spoke little, dressed oddly, or practiced unfamiliar faiths. The harshness of the land did not judge, but people often did. And so, the margins of the frontier grew thick with those who did not fit easily into its narrative of industry, family, and order. And yet, even in these solitary lives, there was structure. A man who lived alone might rise with the sun, chop wood, trap game, mend his clothes, and journal each day's weather. A woman raising children in isolation might teach letters by tracing shapes in the dirt, boil pine needles for tea, and sing lullabies into the wind. Solitude did not mean chaos. Often, it meant simplicity refined to its core. Some of these loners found communion with nature, becoming adept at reading animal tracks, cloud formations, and the faint cues of changing seasons. They followed deer migrations, learned which berries ripened first, and understood the moods of the land in ways no textbook could capture. To outsiders, they seemed feral. To themselves, they were simply attuned. And then, of course, there were the figures who became legends. Old Pete, who lived in a cave and claimed to have seen spirits on the ridge. Liza, the trapper's daughter, who wore buckskin and carried 2 pistols. These stories spread, part truth, part embellishment, embroidered at campfires and in whispered conversations after dark. They became folklore, not out of grandeur, but because the human mind needs stories, even about those who choose not to tell their own. As you rest here, Let your mind settle gently into the quietude these lives must have known. No roads, no neighbors, only the crackling of a fire, the steady sound of your own breath, and the vast stillness of open land. For some, it was loneliness. For others, peace. Next, we'll rise from the wilderness and explore how entertainment thumble though it was offered a break from the grind of daily life, and how, even on the frontier, people found ways to laugh, dance, and play. After long days filled with labor, grit, and the quiet struggle for survival, life on the American frontier offered precious little time for leisure. But even under the strain of harsh conditions and persistent toil, people carved out small spaces, moments of light, of music, of gentle laughter shared beneath the open sky, or the flickering glow of an oil lamp. In these rare pauses, the human need for joy gently emerged, not grand, not loud, but enduring. Leisure on the frontier was never taken for granted. It was not scheduled or expected. Instead, it slipped in like sunlight through Shutter's spare hour after supper, a Sunday afternoon with chores done early, or a rainy day when outdoor work had to pause. These were the windows through which entertainment entered, not as a luxury, but as quiet relief. One of the most cherished forms of recreation was music. Imagine a family gathered around the hearth after supper, the embers glowing faintly in the stone fireplace. From a wooden shelf, a fiddle is carefully lifted. Its varnish is worn thin. Its bow has been restrung with horsehair, twisted and knotted in places. And yet, when drawn across the strings, it produces a sound both warm and slightly haunting, notes that rise gently into the rafters like steam from the cooking pot. Instruments on the frontier were few and prized. Fiddles were most common, followed by banjos, harmonicas, dulcimers, or even homemade drums. Those who could play often did so for other-sat barn dances, community gatherings, or simply outside under the stars. Music carried across distance in a way nothing else could. Its rhythms softened the sting of hardship. Its melodies reminded people they were still part of something shared, something enduring. Dancing followed naturally. The floors were rough, and the boots heavier than ideal. But in community halls or cleared barns, people would waltz, reel, or simply sway to the music. Dances were often held after harvests or during holidays, and they brought scattered families together. Even those who didn't dance would attend, sitting on benches, sipping tea or cider, watching the younger folk twirl with laughter and shy glances. Storytelling, too, was a central form of entertainment. In a world without television or easy access to books, the spoken word carried special weight. Grandparents told tales from their youth. Parents repeated legends and cautionary fables. Some stories were educational, offering lessons about weather, animals, or history. Others were simply told for amusement, full of exaggeration and humor, shaped by the rhythm of voice and the flicker of lamplight. In some homes, reading aloud became a treasured ritual. One family might own a single novel or a dog-eared copy of Pilgrim's Progress. Each night, a chapter would be read aloud, voices hushed, children curled up beneath patched quilts. Newspapers, when available, were read aloud in the same way, offering not just news, but community discussion. An editorial might spark conversation for days. Board games were rare, but not unknown. Checkers, chess, and dominoes were passed down through generations. Pieces were often handmade, carved from wood or bone, their edges worn smooth by decades of use. Cards were more controversial, viewed by some religious communities as worldly or sinful, but still found their way into saloons, bunkhouses, and the occasional family kitchen table. Humor was essential, though not always loud. It was dry, observational, and rooted in daily life. Jokes about weather, livestock, or stubborn neighbors circulated freely. Laughter was a shared medicine, unspoken acknowledgement that life was difficult, but not without its absurdities. Children found their own amusements with whatever was at hand. Cornhusk dolls, carved animals, hoops rolled with sticks, and marbles made from clay. Hide-and-seek games played among hay bales. skipping stones at the river, tag through tall grass. Their play was resourceful and vigorous, shaped more by imagination than possessions. Seasonal events brought a different kind of delight. 4th of July celebrations might include pies, races, and homemade fireworks paper-wrapped powder ignited with long sticks. Harvest festivals brought pies, preserves, and contests. Who could husk corn the fastest? Who had the tallest sunflower? Or the best pickled vegetables? These events tied communities together, building memories that softened the harder seasons. Occasionally, traveling performers passed through. A medicine show, promising miracle tonics and strange marvels. A wandering preacher with stories of fire and salvation. A circus wagon, if luck prevailed, bringing a bear on a leash or a man who could swallow fire. These visits were rare, but when they came, they left a lasting impression. Children, wide-eyed, adults quietly amused. Evenings were often spent in simple companionship. Couples might sit silently on porches, watching the stars and swatting mosquitoes. Neighbors might gather to mend tools, swap seeds, or share stories of the old country. No matter how remote the settlement, the urge to connect, to laugh, to listen, to unwind remained deeply human. As you lie still now, imagine the closing of one such day. The music has faded, the last lanterns flicker. A mother folds her hands in her lap after humming an old tune. Outside, a breeze rustles through dry grass, and somewhere in the distance, a man chuckles softly to himself as he remembers a story told at the last harvest dance. In this silence, joy lingers not in extravagance, but in the ordinary. Next, we will step into the final full scene of this frontier world, the approach of endings, sickness, age, the realities of death, and the rituals that brought closure to a life forged in hardship. As your breathing slows, and the last images of music and dancing fade into shadow, let us now follow the path that comes to all, even here, at the edge of civilization, in the hush of frontier nights, beneath endless skies and amid the whispering grass, life quietly yielded to its end. Death on the American frontier was neither rare nor unexpected. It was woven into the fabric of life, not as a spectacle, but as an ever-present certainty acknowledged, accepted, and met with quiet resolve. Imagine now an elderly man, once strong, who now lies wrapped in quilts stitched decades ago by hands long gone. The room is dim. A fire burns low. Outside, the chickens have settled into their coop, and the livestock do not stir. His breath comes slow and shallow. A wife sits beside him, holding his hand. A child stares silently from across the room, sensing the gravity of what draws the house still. Illness was a frequent visitor on the frontier. Without modern medicine or sterile technique, even minor ailments could become fatal. Fevers lingered. Infections festered. Childbirth, so common, was also one of the leading causes of death. Consumption, now known as tuberculosis, thinned the ranks of young adults. Diphtheria and cholera swept through families, sometimes taking several members within a week. Medical care was sparse. Doctors, when they existed, traveled great distances and often arrived too late. Their treatments ranged from effective to deeply questionable mercury, bleeding, or strong spirits administered with hopeful hands. Instead, most families relied on home remedies, herbal infusions, poultices, warm compresses, prayer. Knowledge was passed down through generations, scribbled in notebooks or remembered from mothers and grandmothers. Death, when it came, was met not with hysteria, but with quiet preparation. Bodies were washed with care, dressed in their best garments, and laid out in the parlor or front room. Neighbors arrived with food, with hands to dig a grave, with a sense of shared mourning that required no instruction. In many cases, there were no undertakers in the community. Funerals were simple, somber, and deeply personal. A preacher, if one could be summoned, would offer words. If not, a family member might read from scripture. Hymns were sung a cappella, their notes drifting up into trees or over the hilltops. Sometimes, no formal service was held at all. A man buried by his son, a wife buried by her husband, in the same earth they had spent years tilling side by side. Graves were dug by hand, marked by wooden crosses, carved stones, or in many cases, nothing at all but memory. Family cemeteries were common small, fenced plots on the edge of farmland, shaded by a tree if one could be found. Here, generations slowly gathered, their names etched by careful fingers into boards or stone, weathered over time by wind and rain. Children often knew death early, a sibling lost to fever, a calf stillborn, a neighbor crushed by falling timber. Mourning was not hidden from them, but shared with quiet honesty. They wore black, if black was available. They helped with arrangements. They asked questions and received answers gentle but truthful. Grief was expressed in letters, in song, in the slow rhythm of work resumed. A widow might wear black for a year. A child might leave flowers each spring on a grave remembered. A father might plant a tree for each child lost. The expressions of loss were subtle, persistent, and often without words. And yet, death did not define frontier life. It punctuated it. In its presence, people cherished what remained. A well-worn book passed down, a quilt stitched with initials, a fiddle once played by a now silent hand. The frontier did not dwell on death, but it did not deny it either. There was dignity in how people prepared, how they mourned, and how they continued on. There were beliefs, too deeply rooted, often spiritual. Some believed in heaven, others in reunion, others still in the simple cycle of the land, ashes to earth, spirit to wind. Superstitions sometimes lingered, mirrors covered, clocks stopped at the hour of death, a bird tapping at the window seen as a sign. The line between tradition and folklore blurred easily, but always offered comfort. And in that comfort, life quietly resumed. The woodpile still needed stacking. The children still needed teaching. Seeds still needed planting. The rhythms of the earth did not pause. And in honoring the dead, the living found their footing once again. Picture, now, the same cabin from earlier. The fire has burned out. A gentle breeze stirs the curtain. Outside, a grave marked by a simple wooden cross sits beneath a cottonwood tree, its leaves trembling softly in the night air. The stars above are quiet witnesses. The land is unchanged. And within the silence, life continues, always moving forward, always shaped by what came before. As this chapter closes, and the weight of all these lives settles gently into your thoughts, let yourself sink deeper into rest. The hardships, the strength, the stillness, they belong now to another time, held like stories inside the earth. You, here, are safe, warm, watching from afar, with reverence. Our journey is nearly complete. In a final moment, we'll reflect softly on all that has passed and all that remains behind.